We're going to begin by referring to one of my favorite sages, Will Rogers, who usually had something brilliant to say, but this time I think he got it wrong. We did get into this mess through stupidity, but it's going to take something else to get us out of it. So actually, I wish he'd said this, which is equally cryptic and equally appropriate, but I think also frankly correct. I'm going to talk about the natural world and within that focus in more on climate change for the next 16 minutes and 29 seconds. It was referred to yesterday that the world is beyond its carrying capacity. Estimate that Carter Roberts gave was 30% beyond, and certainly in the 20-30% range, beyond its ability to carry its population. And it's rapidly moving to a non-sustainable future. Nature is actually very fragile. We think of it as very sturdy, but it's really very fragile. And small perturbations or small changes can produce big impacts on natural systems. So I'd like to begin with some facts that kind of set the context. And I'm sorry to be a little bit downbeat in these facts. I'll try to be more positive toward the end. The environmental movement in the United States is 4 decades old. It started in the early 70s. And despite this effort, despite some good laws and a few other things we can point to with pride, today, 1/3 of Americans live in areas that fail to meet minimum EPA air quality standards. 1/3. 1/5 of the drinking water systems in America violate safety standards. Topsoil in America is disappearing to erosion 10 times faster than it's being replaced, thanks to soil mismanagement along with climate change and growing water scarcity. And each year, the nation loses 2 million acres of open space to degradation and land use conversion, 2 million acres. So we have problems at home, but beyond that, America is complicit in environmental problems at the global level. There are more than 1 billion people in the world who rely on fish as their primary source of protein, many of them in poor nations. And yet 90% of the large ocean food fish are gone and unrecoverable, and 3/4 of marine fisheries are nearing collapse. Half the world's tropical and temperate forests, which are a precious store of biodiversity, carbon, and fresh water, half have already been cut down. And at the current rate, the rest will be gone by mid-century. And the opportunity to save the world from climate change goes to zero unless we have those lungs of the world functioning. So we cut down the rest of the tropical forests, and we're cooked. The U.S. is an energy profligate nation. It's done very, very little to curb its wasteful energy habits and its carbon dioxide emissions. We're 5% of the world's population, and yet we generate fully a quarter of the world's greenhouse gases. 22 tons for each and every one of us, versus China, which is only at 6 tons. India is at 1.5 tons. So we are multiples more energy profligate than any other economy. Plus, and this isn't thought about much, we release 25 million tons of toxic chemicals each year in the United States into the air and the water, which increasingly is finding its way into our bodies. In addition, the world faces an epic freshwater crisis. It was referred to by John Calavan. There are 2 billion people now experiencing severe water stress, and crippling water shortages are appearing everywhere, even here in the U.S. And what's happening is that the world is using fresh water faster than it's regenerating it. And that which is left, in many cases, is being polluted through herbicides and pesticides and so forth. So I think it's safe to say that we've been terrible stewards of nature, and we're now on the brink of ruining our planet. All we have to do to destroy the world's natural systems is just keep on doing what we're doing. You know, spewing greenhouse gases, impoverishing ecosystems, and releasing toxic chemicals. You know, the problem is us. It's our tendency to devalue the future and resist change. Behavioral scientists and behavioral economics tell us that the human brain discounts the future by about 50%. So as the future comes rushing toward us, and you're all old enough to know that the future does rush, there are 5 forces that are fundamentally making tomorrow different than yesterday. And in a sense, limit the lessons of history. First of all, population growth. By mid-century, the world will contain in excess of 9 billion people, up 50% from today. We have about 6.7 billion today. With the growth primarily in developing countries, the pressure on resources will increase exponentially. And to claim that technology will find the means to support 9 billion people denies the fact that it has failed to do so for a much smaller population. So we can't sit here and rely on technology. Sorry, Bill Gates. Secondly is middle income growth. Growth in middle income, middle class purchasing power in emerging economies, particularly like China and India, is just a crucial trend. Rising household incomes will double the world's consumer base by 2025, and world GDP will have quadrupled by 2050. So by 2030, according to our friends at Goldman Sachs, the world's middle class will increase by 2 billion, and discretionary spending and resource consumption will soar. There's a lot of spending power growing out there in the world. Third, the world is beginning to run low on key natural resources. Oil supplies are finite, we know that. Iron ore is becoming increasingly in short supply, as is copper. The world has only 30 years of phosphate remaining, which is one of the 2 key ingredients in the Green Revolution. So look for major price increases in resources, contributing to what I expect to be a tidal wave of inflation arising from excessive world debt, production bottlenecks, and scarce skilled labor. Resources are going to get very short and very expensive. Then what about technology? Everybody thinks that technology is the ultimate silver bullet, but actually technology is contributing to the problem because almost all technology is efficiency and short-term oriented, aimed at stimulating product demand and product obsolescence in our throwaway society. It's incremental in focus, aimed at higher efficiency and quick payback. In many industries, energy is a particular example, have chronically low research and development spending and little incentive to replace obsolete performing assets with new technology. And finally, my favorite megaforce is the failure of government. Government has a record of wholesale failure in solving problems. There's little tradition of acute problem solving in government, little tradition of government units collaborating with each other, little tradition of rich governments helping poor governments, little tradition of legislating profit into public problems to motivate a strong private sector response. And these problems are increasingly misaligned with the government structures that exist to solve them. Many of these structures of government were established when most problems were local. So look at our need to regulate power companies across the nation toward energy efficiency and the so-called smart grid by supplanting a patchwork of state-level regulation with a unified federal energy policy. We need it, we can't get it because of what we call the installed base drag. Governments really are run at the state level, and this is now a federal, indeed a global problem. Plus, I think you're all aware that public distrust of government has really been growing for a long time. And with the partisanship we're seeing in Washington and other places, it's really worsening quite rapidly. Recent polls show that trust in government in America has fallen to 17%, which is the lowest level ever recorded. And there's simply no prospect that we can pass major reforms with that level of government distrust. There's a short-term self-interested outlook that pervades the thinking of individuals, corporations, and governments. Gus Speth, in a book called The Bridge at the End of the World, and I quote, said, "There are fundamental biases in capitalism that favor the present over the future and the private over the public. And these biases lead to a general overexploitation of natural resources and make folly of the term sustainable development." And we've talked a lot at this conference about science understanding. Ignorance and suspicion of science is a big problem in America. And for some politicians to assert that snowstorms in Washington belie the reality of climate change demonstrates not only their ignorance, but their faith in the culpability of the American people. This nation does not understand science. So what most businesses are doing is ignoring or deferring the matter of greenhouse gas emissions. They can do it simply because they have no economic incentive to change their behavior. But does that excuse ExxonMobil and others from funding an active disinformation campaign by a bunch of bought scientists and public relations types? These groups are denying scientific findings just as others before them denied the effect of cigarette smoking on health and the impact of acid rain on nature. That's what they're doing. And because we're so desperate for good news, they've been very effective at confusing the public. So let's face it, a global solution to climate change is not likely. There's a recent McKinsey study that concluded in the US that 40% of feasible reductions in greenhouse gas abatement in the US can actually be accomplished at what's called negative cost, which means it would be enhancing of our gross domestic product. So enhancing that it would fully offset the other costs, the real costs of bringing down emissions from the economy, and create a situation where a net cost of having beaten climate change in America would be very close to zero. So the question is, what do we really do? Whining about this has kind of been a national habit, and maybe a global habit if you were in Copenhagen. But I'm going to argue that we don't need new ideas or new technologies, although they're, of course, welcome. We have enough now to fix this problem. We need to act on what we know can work. And these effective solutions exist if the world will embrace them. The missing ingredients are understanding, leadership, political will, inducements to capital, and management rigor and accountability. It's kind of like responding to the challenge that World War II brought to us. And as a consequence, again, it's hard to sit here or stand here and be optimistic. The United States would have to take four actions as the world standard setter on this issue. And believe me, there's nothing that's going to be done by others real unless the United States acts. First, a cap or a cost to carbon. This is to shift what's known as the merit order of energy adoption away from hydrocarbons and toward energy efficiency and renewable energy sources. And this cap, unlike what's in the Congress today, has to act without a whole bunch of special loopholes that actually, in this case, current legislation would end up favoring coal over natural gas because of all the loopholes to the coal industry that are necessary in order to get the coal state Democrats to vote. We need a cap that actually redresses the energy merit order. Secondly, and I know people don't like regulation, I would argue regulation on balance has been good for America with some notable exceptions, but if we're going to motivate energy efficiency, we cannot rely on markets to do it. The markets don't work. These are what's called externalities. We're going to need a set of regulations and a set of economic incentives to motivate energy efficiency. And 40% of the solution is in better water heaters, better insulation of your house, and factors like that. So that's the second thing. We must address energy efficiency. Third, we need strong public sector investment to help bring new technologies to commercial scale. These technologies are very scale dependent, and there is what's known as a first mover disadvantage. There are limited protections that patents offer. We really need a way to get these technologies tested at scale. Solar is a good example of that. That can ultimately become at grid parity, but it needs more support. And finally, and perhaps surprisingly, we have to reverse the negative trend in the U.S. carbon sink. This is the store of carbon in forests and grasslands and natural areas that soaks up an awful lot of carbon. And since our forests are maturing, they're being cut down, we are losing the capacity of the U.S. carbon sink to absorb our carbon. And what we need to do is protect open space, provide tree planting programs and nature restoration programs to use our open spaces as a way to store carbon. These four actions, if they're taken aggressively, would turn back the problem of greenhouse gas emissions in America and would reach toward the energy independence we all seek. Plus, it would kickstart the world on its related tasks. And I think nothing else will work. So what does this mean for you as concerned and influential citizens. You live in Florida, so you know the weather risk. You've checked your home insurance bill. You know that hurricanes are getting worse. It doesn't take much to make a hurricane much worse. There are things you can do. Some of them are very obvious. You can pressure your political leaders to kind of get smart and act responsibly. They haven't been doing that. You can direct your companies to do the same. You can convince other corporate leaders that change is coming and that regulatory certainty is worth more than the regulatory confusion we have now. You can invest in businesses that support the transition to a low-carbon economy. You can, of course, raise your children and grandchildren to be eco-citizens. You can promote generally a sensible view of what is best for the world, and perhaps you could even seek public office or an appointed position to try to drive the change yourself. Whatever your role, you and I, individually and collectively, and I would say this for myself, really hold accountability for this. It was our generation that acted so willy-nilly with no sense of the impact on the world in which we live. We are responsible and accountable for the mess that we're in, and in a sense, therefore, for its solution. I think our generation has really failed in leadership on this issue, and the time has come for action. We used up our slack several years ago. We have no more slack in the world for this, and you're going to see that the impacts are not going to be linear. They're going to be exponential and very, very severe. At the very least, I'd ask you to go home and plant a tree. Thank you.